Hey, you guys, this is Christy Young with the Gritty Gospel. We have a very special podcast episode for you today, a story all about God's faithfulness in the weaving together of an adoption story. And that story belongs to my husband, Larry Young, and we're excited to share it with you today. But before we do, I just want to say a special thank you to all of you who are watching and listening to this podcast. We are so grateful for the ministry. Please don't forget to like and subscribe and share these podcast episodes. So without any further ado, here is Larry Young with the story of God's faithfulness.
Hey folks, I am Larry Young. I am Christy's husband, and today I have the privilege to share my adoption story. This story, I hope, is encouraging. I hope that this story impacts the church, impacts people who hear it, and really moves them forward in terms of what they could do to impact the life of the orphan and also the widowed. And so my hope today is that you would leave hearing this story both encouraged, know a little bit more about our family, and also just really looking for ways in which, if you are a believer, that you can glorify God. And if you're not a believer, my hope is that you come away hearing this story, hearing about God's faithfulness in the life of somebody. So with that said, I'll just dive in. My name is Larry. I am the husband of the wonderful Christy Young with the Gritty Gospel. And I was born in the 1980s in a little town called Beaufort, Georgia. And my parents, their name is Larry Sr. and Lucy Young, although my mom, her name is Alma, but everyone called her Lucy. And growing up in this town, I grew up as the only child, by the way, but growing up in this town, it was very, very small. It was an intimate place. My parents at the time would work 2 or 3 jobs, particularly my dad. I remember at one time he had about 3 jobs, but his main job was that as an elementary school janitor. And so every day he would go in. He'd work a night shift job, but every day he would go in and during the day and work and clean the bathrooms and the hallways, anything that needed to be cleaned of this school in Gwinnett County. My parents, growing up, they didn't have a whole lot of educational opportunities. They grew up during the Jim Crow era. My father actually graduated from Beaufort schools in 1963. He was actually almost 20 years old by the time he graduated. And my mother, unfortunately, she did not graduate. She dropped out of school at a very young age. I believe she mentioned that she dropped out around the 8th grade. But my father didn't have the best education, neither did my mother. I remember growing up in our household, usually around the 2nd grade, they could no longer really help me with homework. And I remember just sometimes feeling a little bit disappointed and discouraged when I would need some help. And unfortunately, they just could not help me the way that I felt like that I needed that help. But they were still faithful and would push me hard and push me forward. I remember my dad reading one of his transcripts from high school after he graduated. And this tells you the education level. And the transcript had a whole bunch of misspellings, but then it mentioned that he had hoped to go to Morehouse College. And if you know about Morehouse College, it is a predominant HBCU, historically black college in Atlanta. And it's actually spelled M-O-R-E, Morehouse. And on the transcript, it said M-O-O-R-E, Morehouse. And I remember that stuck with me. And that told me the level of education that he had. Of course, growing up, we didn't have a whole lot of money. Again, I was the only child. I remember wanting to go on vacations. I remember hearing my friends who watched the Disney Channel, and they would talk about Disney, and they would talk about going on these great vacations and going to the beach. And I just remember my dad I would say, hey, Dad, I want to go, like, let's go and take a vacation. Let's go to Lake Lanier or something like that. And my dad, being him, he'd say, well, you want to go on a vacation? We'll just go down to the convenience store. It was called Toe to Poke. And how about you get yourself a slushie and you come back and you sit in the backyard and you enjoy that. And I just would get a chuckle out of that. And yes, I would enjoy that slushie. But so, yeah, they didn't have a whole lot. But one thing that they did have was a lot of love. And also growing up around that time in Buford, from time to time, the Ku Klux Klan would march around. I remember several instances they would march at the intersection of Highway 20 and Buford Highway. And I would see them, and some of these individuals would be a coworker of my father, and they would just kind of wave at each other. And then also where I grew up locally, there was a lot of drugs, alcoholics, things like that on my street growing up. But I remember behind the four walls of my home, I always felt safe, and I always felt loved and cared for. And that was even the same for my extended family, for my aunts and my uncles. They just loved me. I never felt fearful in my home, but I always just felt overwhelmingly loved and safe. And no matter what was going on the outside of my parents' home, I knew that on the inside that I was loved. I remember starting school in Buford, and before the first day of school, I remember my dad, he pulled me aside and he said, hey, son, you have an opportunity that I didn't have. And you have an opportunity and an equal education that I didn't have at the time. And he said, and when you go in there, I want you to learn how to speak like your teachers. Don't talk like your mom and I. Because, again, they didn't speak with the best clear English. But my father said, I want you to mimic them. And I want you to talk like them. And I want you to speak like you are educated. And so my dad also said, and also, if you make anything less than a B, I'm going to kill you. And so, my mom and dad were really, really strict when it came to education growing up. And even though they couldn't help a whole lot, they really pushed me to try my best and to try to excel. And so when I remember being in school, this was around second grade, I met one of my best friends. And I still remember seeing this guy when I saw him from across there was a pickup, right? There was a school pickup where the parents would come and pick up their kids. And if you rode the bus, you waited here. And I remember looking across kind of this little concrete, not parking area, but where all the students would gather, kind of in the front, kind of like a portico area at the school. And I remember seeing this kid, and he looked just like me. And he had like the rat tail that we all wore in the late 80s, early 90s as little kids. And he had a wrestling shirt on. I think it was for the wrestler Sting. I think I had on the same shirt. And I ran up to him and I looked at him and he looked at me. And we both said, you look like me. And I'll never forget that. And I think at the time he may have been in third or fourth grade, Brandon. But I remember after that we would see each other, and his mom and his little sister Megan, they would come over to my house, and his grandmother would show up as well. And I remember them bringing things for my birthday. And I'll never forget them. One time they brought a Nintendo system with the Power Glove, if you guys remember that. And I remember thinking to my mom, and again, both of my parents are African American, and that's a community I grew up in. And I looked at my mom and dad and I said, why are these white folks so nice to us? And it was just a different thing. The generosity was just extraordinary to me. And I remember early on just feeling overwhelmed by them and their kindness to me and to my family. And I remember asking my mother one day, I said, Mama, why is Brandon and his family so kind to us? And she said, baby, it was because I was kind to Vicky This is Brandon's mother. I was kind to her when she had Brandon. And so I guess they feel like, hey, we want to be generous back. But over the years, after initially meeting Brandon, we became really good friends. We played sports together. We would play football together. And it was so much fun to be able to share life with him and his family. As we grew up and we went into high school and things, Brandon was just a freak athlete. He was so gifted. And I remember walking in the hallways and people would just talk about how good he was, particularly at baseball. But when at any time he touched a ball, you better look out because he was just a complete superstar. And I remember just really admiring him. And if you know Brandon, if you ever met Brandon, he has such outstanding character too. And he's one of the kindest and most gentle souls that you'll ever meet. But he was an absolute genetic freak when it came to sports. And so over the years, we continued to be friends. And I noticed the visits became less and less. Brandon had moved away. He began attending a different school system, he and his sister. And so we didn't see him as much. And so I had graduated from Buford High School, and I got a phone call one day out of the blue, and it was him. It was Brandon. And Brandon said, hey, would you like to come work with me? I have a job opportunity for you. And I think I was a sophomore or junior at the time. I was at Morehouse College. Yes, M-O-R-E house. And I said, yeah, I'm really interested. He said, well, it's for a job to be a bouncer. He said, it's at Coyote Ugly in Buckhead. And so it paid really well. You work 1 or 2 nights a week, usually Fridays and Saturdays, and you go home. And so Brandon and I, we reconnected again. And it was so nice to be able to reconnect with someone I considered to be a really, really good friend. And so we had tons of adventure or whatnot, being bouncers in Atlanta and Buckhead at the time. And I remember just growing really close with him. And so I continued working there, and then I graduated from Morehouse. I had at that time had met my girlfriend, who would go on to become my wife, Christy, and things were going so well. And I'd kind of, thought about, all right, it may be time to propose now that I have my first big boy job. And yeah, I'd gotten a job with a firm called Accenture, a consulting firm. And so I was going to be an analyst. And so this was probably around the summer of 2005. And I began to prepare for that job. I think it was around May. And I was still working at Coyote Ugly at the time on the weekends. And so Brandon called me and he said, do you want to go out to dinner? And I was like, yeah, man, I'm up for it. And so we went out to dinner. I think it was Ted's Montana Grill. And he said, hey, congratulations on your job. I'm super thrilled for you. I'm excited for you. And so after dinner, for some reason, I had rode with him. I had parked somewhere else. So we get in this truck, and I still remember it was an S10. And before he started his car, he looks at me. He says, hey, I have something to tell you. And I had no idea what Brandon was going to say. And he kind of takes a big breath, and he says, I'm your brother. And I look at him, and I say, yeah, you're my brother, right? Like, we're the Ugly Brothers. That's what we had become known as in the circles at Coyote Ugly. And he's like, no, I'm your biological brother. And I remember at that time, the way I felt, it was almost like everything I knew in my life was not necessarily turned upside down, but it was more of just kind of questioning my identity. And I didn't know like who I was. But I remember turning down the shade in the truck, and there was a mirror there. And I looked at myself, the reflection of myself, and I looked at Brandon. I looked at a reflection of myself, and then I looked at Brandon, and I asked him, I said, so how? And he said, well, neither of your parents are your biological parents. He said, in fact, my mother is your mother. And if you knew Brandon's mom, she was the sweetest thing. She was a little short, white lady, blonde hair, green eyes. And that's who I knew as my friend's mother growing up. I knew Vicky as the mother of Brandon and Megan. And it was shocking to me because, again, my identity, like I'm a Morehouse grad, both of my parents are black, and I just didn't know really what to think. And I remember that evening calling my girlfriend, who's now my wife, Christy, and just really trying to figure out, okay, what does this mean? How does this change who I am? And also, how am I going to approach my parents with this? And so I remember just being so nervous, and about 2 weeks go by, and I was thinking to myself, okay, I think it's time to tell them. And at this time, I was a fairly new Christian. I had just come to the faith and learned about the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I thought, this is a really good opportunity for me to not only approach my parents, but really look at this through the lens of the gospel. And so I went to my parents, and I think it was a Sunday dinner. And it was just me. I'm hanging out with them, and we finished dinner. And I remember sitting on the couch, and my mom was sitting there, and it just came out. My father wasn't in the room, and I said, "Hey, Mama, I know." And she looks at me. She's like, "Know what?" And I said, "I know about my birth." And she immediately, without missing a beat, turns over and yells in the hallway while sitting on the couch and says, "Larry, he knows." And my dad comes in, standing at the doorway of the living room, and he's like, "Know what?" And she said, "He knows about his birth." And before they could say anything, I remember just a welling up of emotion comes over me. And it wasn't anger. It was actually joy. It was actually a humility came over me. Because if you know my parents, they don't like to be inconvenienced. They hate being inconvenienced. Growing up, again, they didn't want to go anywhere. They didn't like going places that would be inconvenient for them. They didn't like their worlds being shaken up. But here, there were these two people who, by the world's standards, didn't have a whole lot. But they took a chance and took in a baby and raised him as their own. And I said, before you guys say anything, I just want to tell you, I see you. And I said, I see you for who you really are. And I looked at my mom and my dad and I said, I thought that I loved you guys before. But what I realized is that I love you even more than I thought I could. Because I see and I appreciate everything you've done for me. I watched you struggle for years to provide for me, to feed me, to give me an education, to take me to the football games, to support me while I'm in college. And I just remember it felt like these people who had so little did so much. At that time, you see, the story about how they got me was so overwhelming because my birth mother, Vicky, Brandon was a small baby. I think he was not even 2 years old yet. And Vicky was carrying me. She was pregnant with me. And it was very hard for her because she was a single mother. And so she and my mom, Lucy, were really good friends. They worked together. They would hang out together. And one day, jokingly, my mom had mentioned something about just wanting a baby, and had been married at the time for many years to my dad, and they had issues conceiving. And Vicky mentioned to my mom that she was pregnant. And so she said to her, I'm pregnant. Vicky said this to my mom. I'm pregnant. And if you want the baby, you can have him. And my mom, Lucy, thought that she was really joking at the time. She didn't think she was serious. And so fast forward, Vicky's giving birth to me. She's alone. No one knew she was pregnant with me except my mother and her baby sister named Chris, who was 15 at the time. And Vicky recalls the story, and she says she's laying on the bed, she's praying, and she didn't know what to do. And she finally felt like God told her that she needed to call Lucy. And so it's 5:30 in the morning. She calls my mom and says, Lucy, that baby that you wanted, he's here. And I think Lucy, my mother, mentioned to me that she was kind of in a bit of a shock because, one, many people don't call you at 5:30 in the morning. And two, she didn't realize that Vicky was serious. But she and my dad hopped in the car and went to the hospital and got me. And I've been theirs ever since. And I think the beauty of this story and what I really want to capture is that here's two people who took in a random child who had very little, but yet they did so much. One of my favorite movies is called A Knight's Tale. And there's a scene in this movie, if you know anything about it, it's about a poor young man named William. And he's born to his father, who is a thatcher. And I believe his mom had passed away in the film. And there's a scene in the film where you see the thatcher, he takes his son, and again, a thatcher at that time was someone who mended things. In this film, he mended fishermen's nets together. And so they didn't have a whole lot. And so the thatcher got in touch with his friend who happened to become a knight. And he asks his friend if he would be willing to take his son to train him up, or at least allow him a better life as a squire to a knight. And so he takes little William at 7 years old, and he drops him off with this knight. And he looks, before he leaves, he looks at his son, he looks at William, and he says, William, I've done everything I could for you. And everything that he could do was to drop off his son to help give him a better life. And later in the film, William had gone on to become a great knight. And keep in mind, his father didn't know this. He hadn't heard from his son in years. And William shows up at the door to his father's house. And at this time, his father's blind. And he knocks on the door and he walks through. And the thatcher says, "Who is it?" And William says, "Sir, I have news of your son." And it's so beautiful because he says, the father says, "Did he change his stars?" And William responds, he said, "Yes, your son, dear Thatcher, did change his stars." And he followed his feet home. And that story is so impactful because just like that Thatcher, my parents, they did the best they could, and they gave out of the little that they had to help change the life of a child. They changed my life. They changed my stars. God used them in a powerful way to impact the life of a child. And so my story is not so much about me at all. It's more about how God used my parents to change my life. He used their little and did so much with it. And so my plea to you, listener, to the church, is how can we use the gifts that we have? Many of us have been blessed abundantly. But how can we use those things to impact the life of the orphan, to impact the life of the widows? We're called to do so and to show them love and care as we see so clearly in Scripture. I want to remind you that my parents growing up, they were not believers. They would do, sometimes my mom would read the Lord's Prayer to me, and I think she was doing the best that she knew how to do at the time between working so often. And every now and then my mom would just open up the Bible and just read a little bit to me, whether it was John 3:16 or it was the Lord's Prayer. It was one of those two, and that was just my mom. But one thing that I just want to challenge us with is, what are we going to do with the blessings that we have to walk out not only the calling, but to walk out the command that the Lord gives us to have compassion for the least of these? I can tell you, as someone who was the least of these, someone who was in a situation that looked dire, and I look at the life that I have now, I thank God for everything that He has given me. And I look at my parents, and it all started with them, just like that Thatcher did for his son. They did what they could. And so I just hope whoever hears the story is encouraged to do what they can to impact the life of a child, to impact a family that's caring for a child. And whatever that looks like, I pray that you're convicted to go out and to change lives through compassion and grace and the love of Jesus. Thank you so much for listening to my story.
Alrighty, you guys, thanks so much for watching. Please share these videos and like and subscribe to the channel because it helps support the ministry so that we can continue to create content.